After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
Welcome back to the greenhouse, everybody. It's been a crazy couple days since our last couple episodes that we've released. And we will be talking about current events shortly, but needless to say, we needed a bit of a break and we wanted to talk about something lighter.
Well, especially when we've also got an extra bonus one coming up too in a couple days.
That's true. That is true.
So we're on the gauntlet for this.
We are on the gauntlet. You know, sometimes the releases are few and far in between, and sometimes it's releasing season. I'd say it's a seasonal varietal. I'll say.
That's for sure.
So we are a bit late to this one, but spoilers ahead for Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer if you haven't seen it already. But it's been 3 weeks since release at this point. I think everyone's had a chance.
I think it has to be longer at this point, right?
I'd say, yeah.
It feels like it's been forever. Maybe I'm wrong, but
no. Let's take a look. Let's see. Oppenheimer release date July 21st. So it's been exactly a month to the day.
Yeah, a month from the day of recording. Wow, how about that?
Okay, yeah, almost you had your chance to see it.
I was gonna say almost as if this was planned, except this was not the initial planned recording date. But whatever.
Oh God, no. So I should probably owe listeners this much. Allergy medication. This shit has got to stop. I don't know what the FDA is getting up to with this, but why are the majority of allergy treatment drugs at risk of putting people out for a couple hours? What is that about?
I don't know. It's weird. I was gonna say it's weird. All that stuff has it's advertised as having these side effects and whatnot. And admittedly, I guess I'm fortunate enough that I don't really need medication all that often. But even when I have, I don't really have the kind that just makes me drowsy. But yeah, apparently that's the one thing that's acceptable. And I guess hey, if anything can give us some reprieve from the stress of daily life in our capitalist society, I guess that's I guess maybe it's a boon rather than a bane.
Well, I guess if you are part of the 14% of the population that experiences drowsiness as a side effect, I hope you're in the camp that gets restful sleep from it, and not the camp that I don't know what happened to me that day. I was mourning a family I never had. That's what this was doing to me, and I'm like, what is going on here? Why am I sad today? It's oh
man,
Zyrtec did that. People have also talked about Benadryl shadow demons, but that's another thing.
Yeah, I've heard about those too. Yeah, fortunately, yes, I've been lucky, at least so far, to just keep my keep a firm upper lip and whatnot, and just
anyhow. All that aside, so months of the day, Oppenheimer came out. I think prior to the release date, it had already become a bit of a meme. In between, the promise of a non-CGI atom bomb sequence, along with longtime Christopher Nolan collaborator Cillian Murphy as Oppenheimer. And also, you just had the Barbenheimer thing going on as well. So it's been great that the movies have been back this year. Did you do Barbenheimer by chance, or did you just see one of the two?
I admittedly have just seen Oppenheimer so far. We intended to see Barbie. We missed out on the same day because the showing that would have been appropriate afterwards, where we could have eaten or something after Oppenheimer, that was sold out at that theater, so we just didn't bother, and we just haven't gotten around to it since. But I still intend to see it. I've heard it's pretty good. Did you see both?
Yeah, we did like a day break, so I think we did Oppenheimer first, then Barbie.
Okay.
So having the day break helped. I'd say both were fun. I think like I didn't like Oppenheimer on the first watch, and then I liked it on the second watch, and then first watch I thought Barbie was fun, and then second watch I'm like, it's giving therapy speak, but it was both were fun.
It's funny, like fun's not really the word that comes to mind when I think of this movie, because it's like it's so serious and whatnot. But like, it legitimately was, I thought, like an enjoyable like experience, right? It's like, it's thought provoking in the right ways, but it's also kind of, I think it. Yeah, so like, fun's not necessarily the first word I would have used, but I think it's an apt description.
Yeah, I think I use the term very loosely, right? But I think in a post MCU saturated filmscape, my metric for what film is kind of modified. So I kind of try to approach it as, okay, all films are spectacle. So the baseline should be, do you find it entertaining in some aspect, and then you build up the critique from there. So my barest expectation was this should be a period piece, and it should be competent at being a period piece. And with those low expectations, I was blown out the fucking water, let me tell you.
Yeah.
So I think amid the writer's strike, we've got some gems coming out, and it was, I think like having this be like the blockbuster this season was not exactly I'm kind of happy the Barbenheimer phenomenon happened the way it did.
And it's funny, like with the discussion of the strikes too, because it is like really like weirdly like timed with it, right? Because like obviously these were like done, right? There was what little post production might have existed during the like eve of the strike. I mean, these movies were ready, right? That's why they came out in this time. But it is interesting that like right when you're kind of like you see this, and obviously like the strikes are occurring for a variety of reasons, and
right,
I mean the superficial take, of course, is that like, oh, now we're gonna have like really crap TV and whatnot for a while, but it's like the it's as I said, it's just interesting like timing with this, where it's like these are coming out right then, as sort of like this almost like last hurrah for a bit for the kind of the Hollywood for a while, at least it seems like.
Yeah, I'm glad that the last hurrah was good, as opposed to like a last hurrah that kind of signifies this declining, rent-seeking, doing the bare minimum for profit industry we're seeing. For sure, with like the TV sector, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, back to the film. What were your first impressions, and did you do a rewatch at all?
No, I just saw it the sort of opening day. Okay. I think it was either opening weekend, regardless. So I saw it then. I haven't watched it again yet. I'll probably just watch it again, like on DVD and whatnot, and kind of the dork in me and the academic and college instructor, some of my immediate thoughts of this movie were just like, man, like I'd love to implement this into a politics through film class. And like I was like started like kind of like piecing together like parts of a syllabus for that, because I was like, I need some syllabuses to go out on the market, and this isn't like a top priority one, because it's like the more important stuff is the substantive stuff that they require students to take, or satisfy more than just like a fun elective. But I was like, yeah, it'd be fun to do, and I thought this movie really exceeded my expectations in a lot of ways, and like it, and I didn't necessarily know what to expect. Like I had seen like some of the trailers, but like I didn't necessarily realize that like with the way the movie was structured, right? It's sort of like you have sort of like the story of like Oppenheimer coming up through the scientific community, and then the manufacture of the bomb, but that's like sandwiched in between like two other framing devices, which are the hearing for his clearance, security clearance hearings. And then you have the bigger, that's like the first layer. Then the second layer that's encompasses the whole thing is the Lewis Strauss Confirmation Hearings in Congress. And it's like, I study confirmation hearings. So I'm like, I studied confirmation, that whole nomination process. I was like, oh, wow, like this was a really fascinating like thing I didn't necessarily expect. And like, I had seen like Robert Downey Jr. I didn't know who he was playing until I, watched the movie, and I was like, oh, Lewis Strauss, and I was like, that name's a little familiar, and I was like, oh yes, like now I kind of am aware of everything that kind of went into that. So it was, I really enjoyed it.
How does the treatment and the depiction of the confirmation hearing process hold up in the film? Does it hold water with reality, or was it a little bit sensationalized?
So, I think there's a little bit of context that's missing, and I think it's missing not necessarily because of like a willful like omission to like obscure history and whatnot. I think it's just missing because like it's Oppenheimer, it's not Strauss, right?
Right.
That's the name of the movie, but like, and you get a little bit of a hint of it, right, when he has like the White House staff. I guess handlers. I don't remember who they were.
Exactly. Yeah, Aaron Reich's character. I remember him. Yeah.
And that's why he looked familiar. I didn't play
Solo. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this movie, like you sneeze in this movie and a celebrity shows up. Like,
right.
Heavily,
surprisingly star-studded cast.
Yes, super star-studded cast in this movie. But when he's talking about them, you get a little bit of a sense of paranoia. Like he has like the sense of like he's in control of this, but there's like like, oh, what if like this happens, if Oppenheimer comes up, and like the context that's sort of missing is that like blood was kind of already in the water on these hearings, because so Strauss had been kind of just like he had been in a number of positions in the Eisenhower administration. And the Eisenhower administration is kind of interesting too, where like it has this, like today it has this very progressive legacy, but it's like kind of by accident. You know what I mean? Like it's it's like you've got like the highways and stuff like that, but like some of the stuff like the Supreme Court, it's like he's referred to his own appointees on the court as a mistake, like they're his regrets, and like they sort of are the ones that like charter in like that brief period where like the SCOTUS was very receptive to civil rights and other individual rights and liberties.
Yeah, wasn't it Souter he called a mistake, or
no? Souter's later. Souter, for context, that's was he a Bush appointee? Like Bush Senior. It was either Bush Senior or Reagan.
Oh, my bad. It was Rehnquist. He called a mistake. Not remembering.
No, not Rehnquist. Rehnquist is a Nixon. It's Warren and Brennan.
Yeah. Warren's a real mistake in history.
Earl Warren. One of the considered by historians like one of the best Supreme Court Chief Justices, and William Brennan, who I think did Brennan. Brennan's done a lot of was definitely much more of a liberal justice in his time, but that's kind of here and there. But like Strauss, so and you kind of get the hint of it in this movie, right? He's very conservative, kind of reflecting that wing of the Eisenhower administration, right? And you have Nixon there as the vice president, of course, too, right? Like there's stuff that like history seems to have like forgotten in like the colloquial sense. But so he had served in a number of positions, and you kind of see, throughout the movie, you see stuff like on the Nuclear Energy Board and stuff like that, different interactions with him and Oppenheimer. But the real reason like blood was kind of already in the water, even before like the Oppenheimer stuff. And I think my hunch is that like, kind of that big moment where who's the last scientist who testifies, it's but when he like kind of says like, oh yeah, we highly recommend you don't nominate him, like that was probably played up a little bit more for like this shock and awe moment. But like blood was already kind of in the water because the Democrats controlled the Senate, can't really do much legislatively, right? But here was like a potential nominee that they could undermine, and so they there was kind of already that sort of expectation. The Oppenheimer stuff did help add fuel to the fire that did sort of secure, because I mean, obviously, like the way they portray it, right, is like, despite the fact that Democrats are in the majority, he only barely fails, right? Because and that's just kind of how appointment politics worked back in the day, right? It's not like today where it's very much kind of just stick with your party with like a few stragglers who are just kind of like, well, they deserve their nomination or they deserve their nominee or whatever. It was a little less contentious back then. And they even mentioned that in the movie, right? That like no nominee has failed since, was it like the 20s or something before him? Like it was something a really long, it was a really long time. So like it kind of adds to the humiliation of the moment when they ultimately do reject him. And of course, JFK was part of that coalition that did defeat him. And in the movie, they portray it as a little bit more like, oh, maybe he was like this significant portion of it, right? I think that's just kind of like, oh, hey, wink, Kennedy, like,
JFK mentioned.
Yeah, like, hey, people know who this is. And that's like kind of a thing, too, that like this movie does, even beyond just the appointment thing, right? I mean, like a lot of the stuff with Einstein is sort of, he's filling in roles of other scientists.
Right.
Like the conversation about like when they do the calculations on if the atomic bomb goes off and they come up with this result that it would just destroy the entire atmosphere. And he goes to Einstein, talk to him. That was a different scientist. I don't remember his name.
There were two others. I forgot who they were, but
yeah,
I was doing my Wikipedia binge before this, and it wasn't Einstein. I know that much.
Yeah, and the conversation with Einstein, that's like kind of another framing device throughout this movie. That was probably fictitious as well. I mean, it's possible it happened, but it's not. It's nothing that's been recorded. And I think the scene with him where like during the security clearance hearings where he's like telling him like, oh, hey, like, you could be like me and just like have like no country or whatever, just like, leave. They don't love you. That is not so much like, I don't think it was a real interaction, but Einstein had said something to a similar effect in like a written statement about those hearings, that he felt that it was kind of disgraceful what was being done to him. And he already kind of had that sort of, it's not exactly a fugitive status, right? But like, he was German born as well, and obviously had kind of forsaken his own country when he came here. And,
I think he made a point to renounce his nationality. Period. I don't even think he took on being American.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a bunch of historical additions in the film that I think like they make sense for the plot, but if you go through the record, they definitely didn't happen in that way. And it was definitely set up to be like because I was watching when I went to the rewatch, John, you've met him. He's been on the podcast with you before. He does have a math background, so him watching this and making comments with the film, it really affirmed that like jokes someone made about the movie were like, this has got to be the Avengers for people who know math. But he's like, oh no, this guy like fucked up my life in calc. Like that was shit I heard watching the movie with him.
Yeah, because it's like, I mean, this era, and I mean, I think some people kind of like I don't know, because like we know about like we're always like taught like from kids about like Einstein, right? And like the energy, and all of his equations and stuff like that,
right?
But we don't really have like any like context for it. And it's really only if you're deeply interested in this later in life that you like kind of dig into it, right? And you get like some of the context here, right? I mean, like he's definitely not a focal point, and some of his stuff is a little bit exaggerated, right? But like, he kind of had sort of like the same issues that like Oppenheimer had in terms of like his political leanings being seen as let's just say compromising. Not so much that they was believed that he necessarily had like Soviet ties or ties to like the Russian Communist Party and all that, but like I mean he did write, and I found this out actually a little bit more recently. He did write a manuscript called Why Socialism, which basically just advocates for a socialist structure to society, which is like completely beyond the pale of anything that you would ever discuss Einstein for in your primary education or anything like that.
Spot on. And like, this is something I wanted to bring up later in the outline. We'll probably revisit this point, but like you were saying, we don't get like a real context for like the world and the times in which certain scientists live in.
Yeah.
And like the thought I had watching this film is like, when did all the STEM lords become like libertarian or like fascist, right? And we'll get into that, but like, this is definitely set in a time when like the scientific community, I think, has a political character, a much more politically engaged character. I think a lot of like STEM guys, people have had the displeasure of interacting with sometimes in like college, are these like professed apolitical types, or people who like have a real disdain for the humanities or anything that's outside of STEM. But then when you interrogate their worldview, it kind of just comes down to like the background level of fascism or Hitler particles, as the expression goes, right?
Yeah, and I was like kind of thinking of this too in like the context, because we've talked about this on the show too for like some of like our current events where like, you know, even like some of your government ones, like, you know, like the CDC and like Dr. Fauci, where it's like these people, like, I mean, he's probably a little bit more politically savvy, I think, than the average person in the CDC, right? But it was like, where these people just have like they're just completely politically naive and don't know what they're like. They don't understand like how like their messaging on like certain things, like, this was a more recent one, right? But they had posted something about how like one of the Moderna vaccines was no longer cleared for use. So of course, all these vaccine skeptics, you know, were like, "Oh, look, we knew it all along, and so did they." And it was like, no, there's more context in the next tweet. They were just dumb enough to put that on its own and just had no clue about the consequences, supposedly. So it's like, it's interesting. So it's like you do get either like, you know, the apolitical folks, or like the folks who just don't understand, like just have like no political literacy, or, you know, those, you know, weirder libertarian or even, you know, fascist types in like the STEM field. And what was the line? You since you rewatch it, you might remember, but like there was a really good line, like when he had like the stuff about like support the Spanish independence movement or the Spanish War, and like the other professor who's kind of I can't remember his name, but he's the more
Chevalier, or
it's the guy who's the more centrist, right? Where he's like, my political involvement is that I vote.
Oh, the long-haired guy. I remember. What was it? James Vander. We're pulling up the cast just so I can remember the guy. I know who you're talking about, though. He was the lab guy. I remember who you're talking about.
The lab guy.
Ernest Lawrence.
Yes. But yeah, so like he had that whole like where like when he like says like, why are you doing this? And like Oppenheimer says like once you see like the revolution in the particles, you start seeing like the revolution in like, you know, the world or something like that. I can't remember the exact line, but I just thought I recall
the line. Yeah.
I was like, and I tried looking it up, but no one had recorded that quote. I was like, man, that's such a great quote, though.
Yeah, let's maybe touch on this thread. This is greenhouse gaslighting. Fuck the outline. Let's get into what happened to STEM Lords. So like the one thing that like before I even knew about Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb, right? It should come as no surprise that Indian people, the minute they find a tangential connection, like it could be someone gave like an Indian restaurant a 5-star review, and that guy's like an ally of the community or whatever. So like, the first context I'd ever heard Oppenheimer like mention was the "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds" line, right? And that comes from the Bhagavad Gita, and that's where, you know, the long and short of it, a guy has to kill his cousin. God basically takes on like a biblically accurate angel form to be like, no, I'm God, I'm telling you to do it. And then he does it, and that's like my very secular American friendly summary of the Bhagavad Gita, right? And that in that line, "and I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," comes from his reading of it. And Indians are like, "Oh my God, he quoted the Gita. This guy's cool." But at the same time, for like a scientist of that era, a highly published, well-respected guy, to have interests in not just the humanities in a passing sense, but like to have like a flirtatious involvement with the Communist Party, to study other languages, including Sanskrit, like that's pretty intense, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And coming to that edge, right? The film itself takes inspiration from Kai Bird's biography of Oppenheimer called American Prometheus, which is mentioned in a line where I think Niels Bohr is like, you know, become the American Prometheus or whatever.
Yeah, I think there might be something that direct.
Yeah, there is. It was that direct. Did you read the book by chance, or did you not?
I have not read the book.
Okay, because I was trying to find like an over under on the book, like is it good or bad or not.
You're gonna have to keep looking. Unfortunately,
well, so the thing is my current lens for understanding the present and like especially when it comes to like politics and political history is to assess like the collapse of the Great Society era of liberalism, and more specifically like the slow death of the American left, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin considered the Oppenheimer case a defeat for American liberalism. Summing up the fallout from the case, they wrote that in a few years after World War II, scientists had been regarded as a new class of intellectuals, members of a public policy priesthood who might legitimately offer expertise, not only as scientists but as public philosophers. With Oppenheimer's defrocking, that's a word, scientists knew that in the future they would serve the state only as experts, only on narrow scientific issues. As sociologist Daniel Bell later observed, Oppenheimer's ordeal signified that the post-war messianic role of the scientist was now at an end. Scientists working within the system could not dissent from government policy, as Oppenheimer had done by writing his 1953 Foreign Affairs essay, and still expect to serve on government advisory boards. The trial thus represented a watershed in the relationships of the scientists to the government. The narrowest version of how American scientists should serve their country had triumphed. And they go on to basically like, you know, look at the Oppenheimer security clearance hearing as like the first salvo in the McCarthyist culture war.
Yeah.
And, you know, loyalty and security tests like would continue to spread through the federal government. So this I just added to the outline. I just want to read this because this is the context in which all this happened. At these inquiries, federal employees were asked questions such as, is it proper to mix white and Negro blood plasma?
Good God.
Another question, there is a suspicion in your record that you are in sympathy with the underprivileged. Is that true? What were your feelings at that time concerning race equality? Have you ever made statements about the downtrodden masses and underprivileged people?
I like how those are like far more mask off than I think we think of today, right? Like where it's like I feel like there's I don't know. I mean, to me, like where it's like, I mean, the race equality, I mean, that's kind of like a little bit more of a hot issue, you know, especially in like the wake of like George Floyd and other, you know, protests and tied to, you know, police brutality and other issues of racial inequality. But like this to say like stuff about like, you know, like sympathy with the underprivileged, I feel like that's like, that's almost taboo to be like just explicitly like, yeah, you know what, fuck them. Fuck the underprivileged, right?
It's like there's a suspicion in your record that you are in sympathy with the underprivileged,
right?
What, like you are holding you on suspicion of like one of the most bare minimum aspects of like the human condition.
Well, and I think I can't remember if I've mentioned this on the show before too. I mean, to give them, and like this was kind of it was ironic because I was doing some archival research for whose archive was it? Let me look that up real quick. Senators. For Philip Hart, a former Michigan senator, or former senator from Michigan, you know, U.S. senator, to be clear, not state senator. And there was a letter that he had received from like a family like that was in like, you know, in Michigan. They were part of the John Birch Society. Well, you know, already.
I think you told me part of this. Yeah.
But like they're like, oh hey, like they're basically criticizing him for like having like views that were like sympathetic to the working class because he like, and he had like in his letter backed them there's one part of it that was really hilarious, but the other part was like, in my opinion, the best cure to socialism, right, is to make sure that people's basic needs are met, so they're not, begging for revolution, that's kind of the thesis of the New Deal, right? It's save capitalism from itself,
and the Marshall Plan more broadly, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah,
that's like the international wing of it, right? But and the other part of that was funny was he's like, I've also, because you remember the John Birch site, I've basically forwarded this letter to J. Edgar Hoover. Thanks for letting me know about your membership. It wasn't like quite, it was a little bit more classy than that, but I just thought it was just like, so I'm like, wow, this is the most like passive aggressive thing I've ever read.
Oh God. Yeah, that's really like how hostile the era was, and like I think it's just like the veneer of respectability as well of just like how much like deep diving someone has to do to get a full picture because of how like pervasive the sanitized image of the era is, right? I don't know how much of a role that plays into like why that lens like affects how we view that era, right? But to maybe get back to like why have STEM lords like gone down this right wing path, I think because it's like to some extent we've basically said like if you're a scientist trying to change the world, let alone like have like these left wing opinions, your goose is cooked. And to Oppenheimer's disgrace, I'll say he didn't even change the world for the better.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's interesting that we like kind of talked about some of this stuff in the aftermath. It's like the one thing, and again, like it's a period piece. Like it's not necessarily about like I don't necessarily think that every detail about everything going on in the world during this or like after this is necessarily important for the movie itself. But like some of this stuff, right, where like this was sort of this watershed moment for the scientific community, right, is understated in the movie in a lot of ways, right? And there's also like another detail that's kind of fun about this, or maybe fun, in air quotes, about this as well, is that the security hearings, by the time they made the determination to remove his clearance was due to expire like the next day, more or less. Like it was just
to rub salt in the wound. Basically.
It was to rub salt in the wound, and like to the points that you've been articulating about different impacts on the scientific community, about how this is kind of like putting them down. It is kind of like we've talked before about various things, where it's like the cruelty is the point.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough, and like I don't think the film says this explicitly, but like. Was the whole thing like at the direction of Lewis Strauss, or was it a combination of interests?
The movie makes it clear that like he had like more than willing pawns, but it was very much initiated by him. That was the impression I got.
That's about the same, and I don't think I've read.
That's sort of like that mask off revelation at the end, right? Is sort of like when the handler's like, oh wait, like it was all you, like it like, and you kind of even see the stuff where like it's like the people that he was working with also didn't really like Oppenheimer either, but it seemed to be that's he's the one who kind of gave them the go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't find anything in my brief reading that like indicated like there were other forces at work. And I don't know, part of me was just like, do the Dulles brothers have anything to do here? But I think he had made enough enemies at that point where he didn't need those guys getting involved.
Sure, yeah.
Let's see. On the subject of historical inconsistencies, there's a couple more I just wanted to bring up. Or do we want to maybe get into a bit of a...
Well, the first one's not quite accurate on your historical inaccuracies. It's the poison apple thing. I think they... In reality, it had nothing to do with Bohr. It wasn't intended, it wasn't intended for him in the movie either. It was intended for his mentor, but like Bohr, like picked it up, and of course, like oh no, my God, am I gonna like murder my scientific hero or whatever? Yeah. But reality. And I think he actually did, like, they kind of portray it as just like, nothing came of it, but he actually did get in trouble
Exactly,
in real life for the cyanide apple. So that was a little different.
Yeah. I think there was like basically the school did like a settlement where his parents like paid a donation in air quotes.
Yeah.
And then I think he transferred to somewhere else. I think Germany or something. I can't remember.
Well, yeah, that's where he ends up going, like in that. But here it's portrayed as like it's purely for like access to like a better scientific community for what he's interested in, rather than like, and maybe both are, partly true, right? But it's not like, he's running from any potential legal trouble.
Yeah. I think another detail that was getting me with the film too, I don't think I think I wrote this a little bit more harshly at the time. I'll pick your mind on this because we're both guys. Our take has to be taken with a grain of salt, right? But Jean's Hatlock, I think some people in the commentary about this movie have been saying how like she kind of just gets reduced to a sex object in the film. And she had like a long career as a psychotherapist and was like also a writer for the CPUSA. So she had like a rich life of her own that I don't think enough attention was given to. And I kind of agree that her portrayal was somewhat flattened to be like the woman Oppenheimer is cheating on his wife with. But at the same
I was gonna say, like, I don't know, like, I mean, she's not necessarily a major subject in the movie, and it's like, it's through his lens, and I was like, I don't know if that's it. I don't necessarily know if like was, and I feel like the attraction to her wasn't just sexual. I feel like there was some intellectual interest there as well, and like,
right,
you get that tease maybe a little bit, but like, of course, it's like while she's naked, so like, how much is that like, it's maybe a little like, overly sexualized in that regard.
Yeah, and like I kind of wonder like how much of my nitpicking is sincere and how much of my nitpicking needs to be taken with the fact that like they tried to cover as much ground as they could in 3 hours.
Yeah, that's true.
And there's so much that like could have been included were it like a televised series or something, but at the same time, like the ground they did make in 3 hours is pretty impressive. I will say though, they got to start putting intermissions in U.S. theaters. This is getting out of hand. Out of hand.
Has there been anything that like I felt like there was like something semi recently that had an intermission, and I don't remember what it was. But yeah, it's like one of those weird things. Like when you watch, like the only like real notable thing I can think of that has it is Gone with the Wind. Where like even on like the modern DVD releases of it, right? You've got that like little intermission screen for a bit, but yeah, maybe it is. It's weird. Like this was a 3 hour movie, but it didn't feel like 3 hours to me. Like it felt pretty like seamless just that whole time. But it is a lengthy undertaking.
I think if you go in and you don't get like the large size slushy, you're good. But if you are the average American and you come in with like that massive popcorn and you come in with that like swimming pool of soda, good luck, dear viewer. Let's see. What did you think of so I know you mentioned that like the film has been sandwiched in between like both the Lewis Strauss confirmation hearing and the Oppenheimer security hearing.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it made like a good point of how big of a contemporary issue it was at the time, or was that element somewhat flattened?
I it's interesting because it's like when I watch it, I didn't have any problem with it, but it's like it's weird where like as like if I was someone who was like reading the history and then I'm like I want to make a movie on this, I would not have made that choice personally. I don't think I would have thought to make that choice. I think that the security hearings I think made some sense. I think the Strauss thing, if I had to guess, that was probably a decision made a little bit later where it was decided that there needed to be like some type of antagonist, right? And I think that's kind of what it was there, was like kind of having like, this is, you know, Strauss, and Strauss makes for a perfectly good antagonist for like the Oppenheimer story. But I think that was kind of the choice there, and that's probably why they sandwiched that. And I think the security hearings, I think it portrayed right that like, you know, because I think like nowadays we don't necessarily associate the name Oppenheimer with anything other than, you know, the bomb.
Right.
I mean, like maybe after, you know, this movie kind of resurrects, you know, that sort of interest, we'll think about him in a much more broader context. But I think that, you know, I think it highlights the sense of that he like remained significant and important well after, you know, the end of World War II.
Yeah, and I think there's a way you can probably read the film to some extent where it's like the film is always following Oppenheimer, and if not him, it's following Strauss in his segments. So you could just like attribute it to being like, well, it's about him, and he always seemed to be somewhat self-focused. So you can view the film through that lens, and also like, I kind of wonder like, there was one critique someone made of like, you know, there's no Japanese perspective shown in the film, and a part of me is like, you know, that was missing, but then part of me is also wondering like, the Japanese perspective was also getting blown to smithereens.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's like respectful to display or not. That's an artistic choice, you know. But
yeah, and I mean, and again, like, you know, does the movie just become like just bloated at that point? But also, like, it wasn't like, and I've seen people like as part of that discourse. It's like this movie has a pretty negative perspective on the bomb, right? Like it's pretty. I don't even think it's like ambiguous. Right, but like these people are like, well, if it doesn't spell it out to me, and like this was like from like a left wing perspective, and I guess it just shows, you know, both sides can be pretty media illiterate. Where it's like I need it to literally spell out, like I need like Christopher Nolan to like, you know, freeze frame, walk out, and say, by the way, bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki was probably a bad thing to do. And it's like that's just childish and juvenile, right? Like I think like when you get into that preachy territory, I think that kind of ruins a lot of movies, anyways.
Yeah, like I think there is this extended problem, like especially online, where a lot of content about film is often, I'd say, it's proliferating a certain brand of like media ignorance. Yeah, and media literacy seems to be at an all-time low these days, right? So I part of me was even wondering, like, my big fear when I watched it the first time is like, holy fuck, people are gonna watch this and have this deranged, you know, beautiful mind of a genius take about people like Elon Musk. And maybe that's like a bit of a hyperbole on my part, because at the same time it's like, you know, forget what other people thought of the film. Did you look at the movie and, you know, implicitly understand the bomb was a bad idea? That seems good enough, you know. Like,
yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, and I think, you know, it's one of those things where, like, I mean, your own ideology is always going to like sort of paint, you know, your experience with any form of media, anyways. Right. But I mean, I don't think this really gave like any thread, right? Because it's like, oh, like, you know, the mind of a genius and whatnot, but it's like it's a mind of a genius who seems to be in constant like self-conflict and self-doubt over various things in his life, right? And like, it's interesting where like I think the way he's portrayed, like, I mean, this is, you know, as like a film character, right? I mean, obviously Oppenheimer's a real person, but like as a film character in this movie, he's really interesting in a lot of ways, right? Where it's like he's portrayed in like at times like a flattering and also super unflattering light.
Yeah. Charming with the ladies, but at the same time, like,
but in a way that's like also kind of like, you know, like, oh yeah, like he's an adulterer, right? Like even like there's like the one random woman that like he kind of flirts with a little bit, and then like during like the hearing, like his lawyer's like, oh, like, you know, they're gonna say that, like, you know, you killed her husband for a heartbreak. He's like, that's not true. He never knew about the affair. And, like, you know, it's like it's like, you know, so it's like, you know, it's like this guy's got some characteristics that we would generally consider to be unsavory, in a lot of ways. So it's like, yeah, he's a very gray character, depending on how you view him and what he did, and, you know, in all aspects of his life, right? That gray, the shades of gray is, you know, maybe darker or lighter depending on your own views.
For sure. And it's like, I think like at some level, people also have to reckon with the fact that like the medium of film, while it is like our maybe among the most prolific in society today,
Sure.
has severe limitations. One of the biggest being there's only so much you can show on film before.
And this is 3 hours.
Like, yeah, this is for 3 hours exactly. Like, and it's missing aspects that I think would have helped it, right? So, and to think about it, there was a BBC like television series with I think like Sam Waterston as Oppenheimer too. I don't know how that one went, but it's like, you know, it's been done multiple. It's even been done as a musical, for crying out loud. It's weird. So it's like, you know, there's been multiple ways to retell the story, but
Sure.
I think like, you know, when it comes to telling long stories, you can take the film route or the book route. And with a book, you have, you know, it's the most thorough, but then you have to sit there and read it. Or you have the film where it's like, you will be entertained if it's done right, but you don't want to sit longer than an hour and a half usually. So, you know, it's like there's limitations to the film itself. So I think that point has to be taken in stride with any film, is like, can the content be reasonably addressed in like the, you know, what's considered respectable runtime for a film.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, there is just the fact that like when you split a movie into multiple parts, there's the perception that you've cheapened the experience somehow, right? So what do you do in such cases? I don't know.
And I don't know. I mean, like, you know, it's like movies like this have a dual mission, right? It's to entertain and also, you know, kind of inform. And I think that, you know, I think it cuts a really good balance with that. And I think that that's like kind of something too, where it's like, you know, you break it up into multiple parts, and that might drain on some of that entertainment aspect, right? Like maybe that's not the best approach to do it with. So like, I mean, I think and again, like, I don't think this movie like overly sensationalizes things. I mean, it was impressive that they, you know, practically recreated the atomic bomb and, you know, renuked you know, the Trinity site. You know, that was very impressive. You know, kudos to the US government for allowing it, but
I think, oh my gosh, what was I gonna say? I think it's like, yeah, you can never expect film to be purely like educational in 100% of its goals. I don't think any film can. Well,
and that's kind of the point, right? Is like, it's more accessible when it's not 100% educational.
Exactly. And that's the thing, is like, I think like, you know, it's the film, to its credit, maybe has like renewed like a certain interest in these topics.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know about this until like the film, right? But
yeah,
Jennifer Granholm, who's now like Secretary of Energy, retroactively reinstated his security clearance in like 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And what was her statement? I can't remember.
And another like weird like local connection there, right?
Yeah, Michigan once again, the most sus state, always involved, no matter what. Where's it? Hybrid, American Prometheus. Come on, Google, give me some results. What's going on here?
All right, we got here we go. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer occupies a central role in our history for leading the nation's atomic efforts during World War II and planting the seeds for the Department of Energy's national laboratories, the crown jewels of the American research and innovation ecosystem. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission revoked Dr. Oppenheimer's security clearance through a flawed process that violated the Commission's own regulations. As time has passed, more evidence has come to light of the bias and unfairness of the process that Dr. Oppenheimer was subjected to, while the evidence of his loyalty and love of country have only been further affirmed. The Atomic Energy Commission even selected Dr. Oppenheimer in 1963 for its prestigious Enrico Fermi Award, citing his scientific and administrative leadership not only in the development of the atomic bomb, but also in enabling the groundwork for the many peaceful applications of atomic energy. We'll be, revisiting that award later in this discussion. The Department of Energy has previously recognized J. Robert Oppenheimer in other ways, including the creation of the Oppenheimer Science and Energy Leadership Program in 2017 to support early and mid-career scientists and engineers to carry on Dr. Oppenheimer's legacy of science serving society. As a successor agency to the Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of Energy has been entrusted with the responsibility to correct the historical record and honor Dr. Oppenheimer's profound contributions to our national defense and scientific enterprise at large. Today, I am pleased to announce the Department of Energy has vacated the Atomic Energy Commission's 1954 decision in the matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer.
So once again, the Church of American Civic Religion has taken this former heretic and rebranded him as saints, which I don't know how I feel about him getting the security clearance back, right? Because it's good that they try to correct the historical record and admit they broke their own rules in the process, but reinstating him as an American hero almost just feels like an overcorrection.
I don't. It's weird, right? Because it's on one hand, it's his, the part about the part about him that makes him kind of morally ambiguous, right? Is that it's the atomic bomb, right? It killed people. It has currently put the world on on edge because of atomic warfare, right? I mean, the Cold War, all that stuff that stems from that, and. On one hand, it's yes, he played an integral part of that. On the other hand, it's part of the state's apparatus, right?
Right.
So it's he, if he didn't do it, would someone else have? I'm not necessarily sure. But clearly the Manhattan Project was going to be attempted regardless of his presence or not. Whether or not it would have been as successful, in terms of, creating the bomb, not necessarily yay, human rights, we have atomic weapons, or anything of that nature. Right. But, I think, it's kind of again, it's the one sort of mark of potential disgrace is also it's on the whole nation, not just him. So I don't necessarily think that, revoking that is necessarily or reinstating it is necessarily a bad demarcation.
Yeah, and I think to some extent how you view Oppenheimer's personal shade of gray, I think it comes down to what degree do you sympathize with his idea of I think he genuinely was convinced, at least in the way the film portrays it, that discovering the technology itself would serve to deter all parties.
Yeah.
And I think he was both naive and maybe, he was only naive to believe that the American state at that point would take his recommendations seriously.
Yeah.
And it's I think the discovery of nuclear armament by the United States with the Trinity test, it kind of defines the character of the American state from that point onwards, right? I wouldn't say that the American state was never imperialistic, nor it's always had somewhat of a warlike tendency even in its past. Mm-hmm. But to have to basically have dropped the bomb twice on Japan as a thinly veiled threat to the Soviets, that set an existing reality on global politics from that point onwards. And to this day, I mean, what we're seeing today is it can realistically be seen as the fallout of that situation.
Yeah, and it's like to some extent too with with the discussion of his morality too. It's like we kind of have we have the line from Strauss like after he's like sort of the mask off moment, right, where he's like he like Oppenheimer should be thanking him for making his legacy more so the scientific achievement of Trinity rather than the actual offensive application of those weapons, right? It's the scientific capability that I mean, whether or not it's it depends on who you are. If you want to separate them from the guy, right? Is it the scientific achievement of harnessing atomic energy or power, right? Whether it's as a weapon or as an energy source or whatever, or is it the offensive use of this, right? That manifestation of America imperial power and sort of embracing that's at one point bipolar status of world powers versus now we're at like a unipolar system in terms of who's kind of which countries are have authority in the world.
Yeah I think I don't know, did they bring up that Alfred Nobel was the inventor of dynamite in this movie or not?
I feel like it probably got a passive mention.
It might have, right? And I think it goes down to
I think it was just in conversation.
I think I recall that scene. Yeah, so it just goes down to Nobel discovers and invents dynamite, and then racked with guilt creates the Nobel Prize. And I think Oppenheimer, I think what makes him so fascinating as a historical figure and then as a character in this film is the sheer existential weight of his sins that he seems to bear at all points, while at the same time never he's never branded with chains for his crimes, but
right,
his reputation's dragged through the mud. He's never truly welcomed back in places where he was once seen as a friend. And then even his reputation, for him to have been dragged through intense political scrutiny, basically, for things that at the end of the day were untrue. Like, this guy was never a rat. And in this case, he was never really snitching to the Soviet Union, nor was he even a ideologically committed communist.
Right. And I think that's a thing too, where it's addressed with his wife a bit, where they kind of ask her about her affiliations with the party as well. And I think that's one thing that kind of gets forgotten about in the modern context is sort of how the American communist movement sort of morphed into sort of this, became embedded within, the Soviet Union and stuff like that. And it became, committed to that project, which I think is always kind of, I mean, and that's kind of why, you have, not to necessarily legitimize McCarthyism and, the overblown nature of what it did, right? But that's really kind of what helped, maybe give it some level of credibility, right? Is the fact that there was is linked to espionage.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is that there was a visible and diverse, not just ethnically or demographically diverse communist and socialist movement in the United States. It was it was a real camp for people to join if they were disaffected with the liberal wings of the Democrats or with, the increased anti-communist character of the Republican Party, right? So even within the American left, you had Trotskyite factions who were opposed to the Soviet Union. You had people with misgivings about the Soviet Union. Then you also had full-on Marxist-Leninists who were with the Soviet line, people who were approaching a synthesis with China. So it was a ideologically diverse movement, and I think the way they were all played on each other and then fundamentally either softly folded back into what we now call the progressive left, or basically, convert to liberalism or die, was basically the option for the American left, right? So Oppenheimer is kind of I wouldn't say he's there at the apogee of it, but he's he's in the era where this decline is slowly but surely beginning to happen.
Yeah, for sure.
And this kind of feeds back into so another point in our historical issues line. I wrote this point down wrong in the outline, but the film's insinuation that Boris Pash may have had a hand in Jean Tatlock's death, that's an interesting point. So from the little investigation I did on Wikipedia, Pash himself is a very interesting character. He's from a white Russian family. Vociferously,
they talk a little bit about it in the movie, where like the general talks about like his background, right? Where he's like,
yeah,
you don't talk to this guy. He's like, he couldn't hate communists more if you like, if they killed his mother. Like that's like, this guy is bad news for people.
This guy was bad news because, and this is mainstream report. This is on Wikipedia. This is not me digging deep in some like untrustworthy source. He was tasked with doing wet works.
Yeah.
And specifically, like, I think his division was like the external branch, the doing security for the Trinity Project. And like specifically, they were trying to, especially once the Nazis have been beaten, were solely focused on preventing communist infiltration of the project, which, sorry, you were looking at the wrong guy. It was Klaus Fuchs at the end of the day. But from what I saw is that in American Prometheus, they don't say this outright. What they do have is a quote from a doctor saying that the medicine found in Jean Tatlock's system is conveniently what a very good killer would use if they wanted to stage a murder or if they wanted to commit a murder. Jean Tatlock's own brother had openly suspected that there was foul play in her death. He did not believe that it was a suicide. In her record, it is said that she had clinical depression and had taken her life mainly because of, the implications of being a queer woman in those times. It's believable, but for Christopher Nolan and the film team to basically come out and be like, no, if someone did it, it was probably Boris Pash. That's pretty bold. I had to give them that much. And it's like if you look at the pieces, it's like, well, it's not written explicitly, but if you had to name a culprit, it seems like he's the guy.
Yeah, it very well could be.
And just an additional piece too. There wasn't a lot of reference made to this in the film. Like, I think only passing lines were made. The fact that the land at Los Alamos was expropriated from both residents and indigenous people. Nor was any reference made to the downwinders. So these were people who like were in the area when the test happened. Yeah. And I think like there are people who are still dealing with like cancer after the fact.
Okay.
That wasn't covered in the film, but I think because of the film, there's been like some renewed interest in like getting additional compensation and resources to those folks. So I think, that's got to be a silver lining.
Yeah, I think for sure. Yeah, I mean they weren't a major focal point of the movie, but it's nice that they're are able to get their cause some relevance.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. We covered that whole stretch of the. Okay. So we already mentioned spoilers, but let's talk about that ending sequence. My fucking God. I think like in the first part, in my first viewing, I mentioned that there were a lot of the aspects of the film that fell flat or were incomplete. But I think on my second watch, what I was able to determine was that if not for that ending, yes, everything would have fallen flat. The ending kind of wipes the flatness away and like puts it behind one coherent message.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's like a couple messages in it, right? Like, because it's like there's because it's the exchange with Oppenheimer and Einstein that we had seen a couple times in the movie, but we never like heard what they were saying. But now we finally do at the end, and
And this is after the Senate aide, I think, like chastises Strauss for being like, they were probably talking about something way more important than you.
Yeah, well, he's like, he turned Einstein against me. That's why Einstein couldn't even look at me or whatever that day. And then he's like, they were probably talking about something more important. So Einstein is talking about how you'll get your flowers for this someday, and like the rewards, for creating the bomb, and he does, and they show this in the movie, but like it's not for you, it's for them. To kind of as like their sort of like pat on the back for like what we did was right, and whatnot, and sort of absolving their own sins through him. And then then Oppenheimer talks about how remember when I talked to you about that equation that I thought we might blow up the star chain reaction that'll destroy the world, and then he says, I think we did. And then of course you see like the different explosions and whatnot, kind of going through like his sort of mental landscape. Really powerful, really effective. I think I think a lot of people come out with the whole chain reaction thing, blowing up the world and whatnot, which, I mean, yeah, that's probably the one that's maybe most relevant to other people too. But I think that the other part too is maybe just as relevant as well.
Yeah, I think like if you take it as both an artistic as well as a political indictment of the present order of things. We've already talked about how the proliferation of nuclear weapons has really like reset and created the new paradigm under which international relations take place today. Mm-hmm. You can also just see it as like a kind of reinterpretation of Fukuyamaism, where, yeah, that is the end of history, but rather than the end of history being 1999, it was the Trinity test in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in some ways maybe that's the more like, I mean, not that I'm a big end of history fan myself, anyways.
I'm not a fan either, but it has certain explanatory powers.
If we were to certainly like adapt that framework, I think you might have a better perspective that like it is like, if not the Trinity test, it's Hiroshima, right?
Yeah.
That's like where like this is maybe sort of the end of I think a very clear historical break, right? Because I'm obviously whatever relief Fukuyama spoke of at the end of the Cold War, I mean that's gone now. I mean, I think Ukraine sort of dismissed any notion that was like some comfort that we had, if anyone did feel like I mean, I don't know, I'm personally, I'm not like overly paranoid about like the prospect of nuclear war, in part because I see nothing I can do about it, so it's maybe that's a little bit of a nihilistic approach, but I think that's kind of
is it nihilism or is it being practical?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I kind of make fun of one of my family friends for he there was an Amber Alert a few like a month or two back, and he's like he's like, when I just like heard this alarm on my phone, and my first assumption is, of course, right, and I'm like, well, no, what is it? He's like, that a nuclear attack. And I'm like, oh my god. But like he's been on this like ever since like the Russian invasion and whatnot of Ukraine, and as I said, it's just like, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, like, you're retired now, I think you need to find some hobbies or like get back into your hobbies. Like, you're going crazy.
Yeah. No, I mean, and to your point too, I am not a Fukuyamaist. I just like making fun of him.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I do too, anytime I get the opportunity to. I don't always, it's not always successful when I talk with the comparativists in my program. Some of them are a little bit maybe more sympathetic to Fukuyama, but
I mean, if anyone's been right lately, it's been John Mersheimer, but let's not go there. I know he wakes up happy every day. I know when that shit happened, he was like, oh, what did I tell y'all? What did I tell you guys?
Well, I mean, there's a whole, I mean, it's semi relevant to this because this is about nuclear weapons, but I'm like, there's a whole like thing that we could get into about like, why deterrence doesn't necessarily work as intended and stuff like that. But that's kind of a much broader discussion that I think what we signed up for today.
Why doesn't deterrence work? Sometimes a crazy ass white guy with a gun is going to show up. Well, what are you doing then?
Well, I mean, the point is like it doesn't work very well when like it's done on like against like these proxy states, or I mean, proxy states kind of makes it sound a little different in this conflict. But like even like obviously it didn't stop Vietnam, it didn't stop like the Korean War, all that stuff, right? It's because like those states don't have nuclear weapons. So like what it's done is it's created like this world where like those who do have it are able to flex a lot more muscle than those who don't.
Yeah.
And yeah, like they don't go to war with each other, but that also, ignores, a non-insignificant portion of the world's population who does not, call a country with nuclear weapons their home.
Yep. That's probably the best way to sum that up. Let's see. Yeah, no, we covered a pretty wide berth with this. Okay. The treatment of communism and radical politics in the film. What's the over/under?
Well, I liked it. I thought it was done generally rather tastefully, and I thought and particularly I liked the dynamic between like Oppenheimer and I keep forgetting the other guy, right? Where it's like, like you have that like very clear representation of just kind of that liberal centrism, right? From Ernest Lawrence, where as he said, like his political participation as he votes, right? Whereas like Oppenheimer is, like even if he's not, he's going to the the communist parties, but like parties, like social events, not party the organization, but and you have like him advocating for like unionizing like the physics lab and all that stuff. And as I think it's interesting, like I liked the way it was portrayed, where like you get to see, I think the direct conflict of those. And I mean, obviously we experienced enough of that conflict ourselves, but I thought it was done in a fairly tasteful way. I don't think that the ideology itself was presented as necessarily problematic, beyond just its ties to the Soviet Union, which is addressed in different ways, and when we talked already about sort of the diversity of that movement that has sort of been lost in the annals of like mainstream history.
For sure. I think like I was refreshed with how little McCarthyism actually like played into the flavor of the film. I think it was more. Yeah, I mean, it probably played a lot closer to like the hard and fast of Oppenheimer, and then specifically people in his sphere having an interest, if not involvement, in communist and socialist politics.
And there was, like Strauss had a dig on him, and I don't know if that was necessarily reflective of their actual relationship. Oh, a dig on McCarthy, where it was like that like he saw like the McCarthyism stuff more explicitly as like a clown show, versus what he saw as maybe more again, his issues with Oppenheimer were probably more personal focused than anything else, but you kind of get this impression, right, that there's like even as I said, it has like this negative stroke against McCarthyism, but it doesn't like overly like dominate the picture.
Yeah, and that's something I'm interested in examining somewhat, right? Is like in the World War II and beyond era, communism is not like a direct ally of the American state at any real points. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a couple like socialist leaning folks in FDR's cabinet is as far as it went, as far as I understand.
Sure.
But you kind of have this like spectrum of people who are enthusiastic to some extent about the Soviet Union as allies, particularly in the context of fighting the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have probably the opposite contingent, which I guess is, like we're getting into like Smedley Butler conspiracy like territory, right? Of like the what was it, the American Business Plot or whatever, where like they see the writing of labor resistance on the wall and need to get this like communist threat exercised before it presents a problem to their world order.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like Eisenhower was not an ally to communism per se, but I think like he sat squarely in the middle of like formerly having to work with them or like being like on an allied front with them to like working in concert with like, you know, a whole slew of anti-communist crusaders. You got the Dulles brothers, you got Nixon, you got J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, you got the whole gang. The whole gang's there.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, like from anything I've read about like Eisenhower, I don't think he necessarily had firm political views, or at least not many, in the way that we would like conventionally understand them. To be honest, like he just seems very pragmatic on pretty much every front.
Yeah, and I mean, for sure, it's like the progressive veneer some people choose to give him, like, I think is, you know, it's a bit farcical.
Sure.
I think there were definitely, like, you know, aspects where it's like, nah, he fits right in line with like standard, you know, American conservative politics, but I think the evolution of like because I mean McCarthy is only one actor, right? Like Nixon's own brand of anti-communism was almost hysterical at points. You have and I mean you have the cast of characters he creates with like Kissinger and whatnot. So
yeah,
there's different flavors of anti-communism that are brewing at that time, and I think like once Nixon gets into the fray, then the McCarthyist flavor is what everyone's working with. But that's besides the point. This was my shitty attempt to pitch a research paper. I don't even know where that's gonna go.
Well, you know, I've got a lot of research already to work on, so don't give me more homework.
I have a reading stack I'm slowly working through. I'm finally making progress, but fuck me. This shit does not stop growing. Okay. We already touched on this to some extent. Were the female characters relegated to the side?
Mostly, but I think they did have a few like strong moments. I think like and like I think it was the way like they portrayed like his wife in particular during the confirmation hearing.
Right.
Like when like that's like her real moment shine, and like it's framed in a way that like yeah, like, you know, this is a woman, she's really sharp, like almost like, isn't this shocking? And like maybe that's kind of problematic in itself, right? But I mean, like I think, you know, definitely to like the men in the room, it probably would have been shocking because, like, you know,
for sure
they're not, you know, they're in a pretty dominated profession, and probably have a male dominated worldview. But I mean, I think they weren't. I don't know if I would describe them as unimportant to the overall movie, but I don't think they played a super significant role.
I agree, and I think if you take the read that like if you follow the film as Oppenheimer's perspective, he probably thought that way, and also like what the film did do to its credit, I think like anytime you look at like a period piece, especially like from this like 40s era, especially. There's like this almost like neurotic character in all gender interactions.
Yeah.
Like in the Sopranos flashbacks, you see that. In like parts of Mad Men, you see that. For sure in this, like there's just like this background level of like severe repressed mental illness that like everyone is just like hiding.
Yeah.
So I'd say like at least it covers like, yeah, gender politics were trash this time because, wow, men and women really could not communicate with one another. Really, like, the major downside of, like, that era's patriarchal approach. Okay. We already talked about aspects of the film falling flat. One thing that I did see as an allegation is that the film was aping an Aaron Sorkin or Oliver Stone aesthetic. Is that criticism merited?
Not, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I'm not.
It wasn't written like a Sorkin film, so I don't know what the person saying that was thinking.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't necessarily see where that's coming in from. Like, were they specific in like the Sorkin film that they felt it was kind of?
I mean, Sorkin's films also are like pathologically like his brand of liberalism writ on the screen. This film was a little less, so I don't I didn't find it Sorkin-esque. I also think that like people saying that it was more Oliver Stone style, I didn't buy that either, because like this film and Stone's films have like, you know, the psychic trauma or the psychic pain that the character feels like expressed through the film in addition to the retelling of the events. Like Nixon especially does like, you know, like a good depiction of that. But again, like I think Oliver Stone is like he's operating from a very like 70s conspiracy theory mindset.
Yeah.
Whereas this film is kind of it still has that Nolan touch to it where I don't buy it. Another criticism that also I saw that I thought was funny was this a superhero film masked as a period piece?
I don't.
Probably the hat scene, the hat suit up scene probably was the only aspect, but
maybe. I mean, honestly, I mean, and this is going to be something that probably pisses off some like, you know, film heads who kind of like see like where it's like, oh, like cinema is dead, right? That like movies are made, but they're not like real movies, and like that like refers to like superhero movies, right? Like and even like, you know, I mean, like Martin Scorsese gets a lot of crap for it, right? Where he says that he doesn't see like them as cinema and stuff like that. That's probably the most major figure who argues that. But I'm like, this is probably going to piss those people off. But I feel like there's so many like superhero conventions in like superhero films that I think have just kind of been absorbed by the, you know, by films at large, that I think like it's like I can tell you, like, you know, I can identify like story tropes, right? Of like, you know, this is like, you know, the hero's journey structure. This is the origin story type structure. But like in terms of like just things that happen in superhero movies, I think like other than like special effects, that the superhero gets like some cool costume most of the time. I mean, maybe they have no costume depending on who they are. But like, I feel like a lot of that stuff is just so like ingrained in films now that it's hard to really say that like there's a clear break in those tropes in terms of like, this X, Y, and Z happened, therefore this is now a superhero movie. It's like, so I'm like, you know, were there things that like I could have seen happen in a superhero movie? Yeah, probably, but I mean, I think the genres are just so fluid now anyways that like I think that like saying that this is a superhero movie just disguised as a period piece, I think is silly.
I think there's enough of a media industrial complex around this particularly like media criticism content, right? So like from the days of Nostalgia Critic onwards. That's not to invoke that name. Oh God. But like
those some dark memories coming up.
So hey, we remember it so you don't have to. So I think like, you know, there's always click culture in any online space. I'd say like I was definitely on like there's way too many superhero movies these days team for a bit, but the thing is, once all those guys started only talking about that as their like means to, you know, produce more podcast episodes, produce more video essays, whatever their desired medium was, that's when I'm like, okay, we can stop beating this horse. And like honestly, like if you're bothered by like the domination of one form, I think it's incumbent on you to then like promote, defend,
make a movie, dude. What are you doing?
Make a movie first. I mean, seriously though, I mean, maybe, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, like if there's a genre that you feel like deserves more attention, maybe like, you know, you can do something positive and like bring that to the forefront with like your little platform. That's a separate point.
I kind of feel like that's just like a broad criticism I have of a lot of like kind of like the backseat armchair critique of different things, right? Where it's just like you have these problems, yet like you're like it's not like there aren't alternatives that exist to these things, right? It's not like people are like, oh, there's like no other non-superhero movies. There are other movies. I mean, maybe like some of them, yeah, they don't necessarily get carried in the theaters, but like you're not doing anything to like elevate those with your platform, you know, as small or large as it may be. Like you're not doing anything productive. Just continuously pointing out the same thing that a million other people have pointed out before you.
Yeah, and it's like, I'm sorry, once Scorsese said it, you can't just quote him ad nauseum. He's gonna tell you to stop breaking his balls at a point.
Well, at this point too, it's been it's basically become a meme where everyone just posts like "This is cinema" with like his face on the side. For, like anything, right? It's like, you know, like 2 girls, 1 cup. This is cinema. Like that's just like it's like one of those things where like whatever like the original context was has just basically been like absolved at this point.
Precisely, and I mean, I will say though, like when he put the hat and the suit on, like I did laugh in that scene. I'm not gonna lie.
I feel like that was kind of a little bit of the point, right? Is it is like, you know, like you said, it's very it did feel a little bit more like kind of that type of like a superhero scene.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it was in the context of just be yourself, so I get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which did mention that might have been like the corniest thing about the movie, was like just to be yourself little message. Like, I mean, like, you know, like it's not a bad lesson, but this felt like a weird outlet for it.
Yeah, I think no, it makes context in the historical piece where it's like he's literally wearing like an Army Corps of Engineers like uniform.
Yeah. I mean, he looks ridiculous. Like,
and yeah, and Isidore Rabi has to be like, "Come on, dude, what is this?" Okay, so I know you did mention this at the start of the episode, you know, like politics in film, and I was thinking in the context of this film. Once I watched this with some friends, I thought about like a 6-film like feature where you start with Oppenheimer and then you work your way to JFK, Nixon.
You know, I haven't seen enough of these movies, to be honest, to like really comment on like, is this a good idea? But I mean, it sounds cool. Like it sounds interesting. I mean, I don't know if it'll like if production values will start making it seem a little weird as you start like stringing them together like that. But yeah, I mean, and even like that would be like an interesting framing. Like usually like the way like politics or film courses are like taught. Like I've taken one. Myself, is like they're usually kind of like framed through like, or this is like this general topic that's sort of encapsulated by maybe 1 or 2 movies. But it'd be interesting to kind of do it in that context of like, all right, well, here's like this period, and like there's a bunch of political lessons that you can sort of observe from, you know, definitely Oppenheimer and probably a lot of these others too, beyond just like this is political because it's about a president.
Yeah, and it's like I think like I saw this in the context of like, what if you treat Oppenheimer as like a, you know, as a prequel to JFK? Marginally different films, just they are not even thematically in the same world. The JFK movie isn't even about John F. Kennedy. It's about the New Orleans district attorney and his investigation into the JFK assassination. And his like allegations on why the Warren Commission report doesn't fit. So it's like 2 tonally different, that's conceptually really different films, right? So it's like, on the one hand, like if you went just like by chronology alone in structuring like a film canon or like a film class, you would probably give either like amazing whiplash, or you would have like the opportunity to like teach not just history, but historical implications and film theory in like a disorienting and eclectic way. It could be good or it could be bad. So it's like, you know, you could start with the Oppenheimer thing and just be like, okay, what you can situate it in the style of like Nolan's, you know, film style. And then you go to JFK and then you go into like the discussion of like, you know, the Warren Commission and that era's conspiracy theory culture and how that was like a watershed moment in how like political trust and trust in institutions has been on like a downward trend or something.
Yeah.
So there's for sure angles you can take with it, but I think like the last movie I had in mind in that canon was like Vice.
Okay.
And that's like a
very different tone from this.
Completely different tone.
Yeah.
Where it's like this is like a drama, and then at like Vice, you're at like dark comedy thriller, you know?
Yeah, very much like a dark. Yeah, it's very much like a dark comedy. Also, like kind of, it misses a lot of like the trapping, and like not necessarily saying that like neutrality is like necessarily like good in like a political movie, but like that one definitely has like no trappings about like making it clear. Like, I mean, you would literally have the shot in the movie where during Dick Cheney's heart surgery, they like zoom over the chest where there's no heart before they transplant it in. It's like that one's, but yeah, like those are completely different movies. I enjoy Vice too, but it's not. That is definitely if you went from one to the other, it'd be a huge tonal whiplash. But again, like in a film class, you're usually trying to like sort of explore kind of a variety of genres anyways, so.
Well, let's say you're teaching the class next semester. What are some films you want to put on the docket?
Oh gosh. So I would definitely put this. What are the other ones I've been thinking? There's one of the ones that I watched and when I took it as an undergraduate student was Bulworth. It's this old movie from like the late 90s. That's kind of it's sort of like this commentary on like the neoliberal paradigm of the era and whatnot, and the characters.
Bulworth. Oh my god, I know. Yeah.
There's some fantastic scenes in this movie that completely caught me off guard, and I think the entire class off guard when we saw.
This is like a war. Yeah, he's like a Warren Beatty's playing like a neoliberal senator, and then like he becomes a rapper. Like,
yeah, like well, then like there's like a scene where like they're like he's in a black church, and he's like. He had like this prepared speech, but then he's just like, yeah, whatever. And then he's like, kind of like just talking about like they're asking like, oh, why haven't you or like President Clinton come and visited us? He's like, honestly, because like it just doesn't matter. Like you don't pay us enough. Like, he's like, come on, let's call a spade. Like, yeah, what are you gonna do? Vote Republican? Let's call a spade a spade. Like, so just like portraying, and again, like it's like this is. Late 90s, but a lot of these things where it's like they just have not they have aged all too well in their political messages.
Oh my god.
But I would definitely include this one. I think I would include I'd probably have Vice somewhere on there as well. There's All the Way with LBJ, which is another this was an HBO one. You have Bryan Cranston as LBJ. This goes through. I actually.
Oh yeah, I've heard.
This one's really good. I used that one in my Congress class last semester when we had like that sort of buffer week, where after not to bring the tone down again, but like after the school shooting, and I kind of was like, all right, let's kind of like relax things a little bit. Here's a movie, it relates to stuff, and it actually I think helped a bit because like a lot of the concepts I had already talked about came up in the movie, so I came across like a genius because it was like reaffirmed by like something that they saw as credible. Being like a high production movie, people are like, oh wow, it's just like you said. I'm like, yeah. Turns out I know a thing or two, but
yeah, no, those are for sure good options.
I'd have to think about it more. I mean, there's definitely a lot of other options out there. But yeah, unfortunately, I am not teaching this next semester, which is in fact next week. So I do not have to necessarily be prepared to have a syllabus ready and fully armed and operational, as it were. So
yeah, no. Best of luck with you to the next semester, by the way. But yeah, no, like this would you'd have to plan like not just like a canon of movies that arch towards a kind of political history you're trying to teach, but then also like you'd have to mix it in with like film theory and like storytelling and all that. So it would for sure be an endeavor on its own, but I think
I've done some of the work. It's just like it's not ready for next week.
I think we got to definitely write the greenhouse gaslighting film canon. We for sure need to write that.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
So I know we touched on this briefly. Performances. This was like a star-studded cast. Specifically, I think you had RDJ as Lewis Strauss and Cillian Murphy as Oppenheimer. What would you rank the performances in this film?
I don't think there's really any bad performances that I could think of. I thought everyone did a pretty good job. There might have been like maybe some minor role but nothing stood out as like bad. Nothing like took me out of the movie where it's like, oh yeah, like so and so gave like such a shit performance. If anything, like there might have been like an issue of like just too many stars and too many names in the movie where it's just like it sort of takes you out when you're like, oh hey, it's so and so.
It's Josh Peck. What's he doing here?
Yeah, right. Like, you know, like that's like there was maybe a little bit too much of that, but I mean, I don't also know that's like it's not like it's not like a, you know, a game ruiner or anything like that, but it's just like it's like the only thing I would kind of say with that specific front.
Yeah, it's like I wouldn't call it like a distraction or anything, but it is like you don't see like major star-studded like films like that anymore. I think like
when it's not like and like to be clear, it's not a distraction when it's like the main roles. It's a distraction when it's like just like, you know, like
this guy's just here for 5 minutes, doesn't show up ever again.
Yeah, like here's Casey Affleck, like just kind of like there, right? You know, it was kind of like, oh, that's kind of like weird, like, but you know, where it's like obviously like yeah, like RDJ, like yeah, he's main character. Cillian Murphy, main character. Those ones I didn't necessarily they weren't necessarily distracting.
Yeah, I think like maybe like there was something about like Cillian Murphy's like American voice that like kind of threw me for a loop, but again, like Oppenheimer did have that weird voice, so I'm not exactly turned off. And then like again, RDJ in like a serious dramatic role. I think like one thing people were worried about is like, you know, has him being like playing the same role for a while, like, you know, has it put him in a position where he might not be able to act or have trouble acting? No, he pulled that off easy. Yeah, he pulled that off super
He just
easy.
has such a weird career, right? Because it was like Iron Man was like really like the renaissance and like revival of his career, right? Like it was kind of like he was, you know, he had a lot of, you know, drug problems and stuff like that kind of, you know, put his career on hold, and then, you know, it sort of revived with that. And he's been in a few other things since.
Yeah.
I think mostly like I don't think he's really been in a whole lot serious since.
And to be fair, the Marvel contract like kept him busy. Like he had.
Yeah. Though I mean, he put out like Tropic Thunder, which I think didn't he get nominated for?
He got something for that. Let's pull this up.
Because my brother mentioned it to me. He's like, you know, people are trying to like cancel him for that. I was like, I mean, I know his character was like in blackface, but that was like the point. The point was that the point. Like,
yeah, I don't know. It's first of all, the whole thing about people are trying to cancel who and what. What are you saying?
Right. Yeah. It was just like I was like, I mean, like I'm like, this isn't like exactly like news that he had that role and like did that character, but I'm like, that was. The point of that was he was like making fun of those actors, like.
Yeah, I think they were specifically making fun of like Daniel Day-Lewis with that one. Yeah, best supporting actor.
Yeah.
That's funny. Okay. I think we already talked about this abstract aspects of the film. Okay, so this is probably the one thing that changed from my first watch to my second, but I'm going to ask you this anyways. Was the film a biting indictment of a technocrat, or was it a hagiography of Oppenheimer? Does it say something, or does it say nothing at all?
I think it says something, right? I don't really think it's necessarily like, I don't think it necessarily fits well or cleanly into either of those categories, right? Of like, you know, it's because I think like on one hand, like I don't think he was a technocrat, right? You know, I think he had like real political views beyond, you know, any of, you know, his connections to radical beliefs and whatnot. I think he had like legitimate, like he was sort of a man of the world in a lot of ways, but I also don't think like, you know, he definitely doesn't come across like a saint. And I think that's, you know, as I said, it's a movie about like a complex character. And I think it's designed to make you think about, you know, what things have done, right? And, you know, and it sort of has that like broader theme that you kind of see it come up a lot, right? I mean, maybe most frequently in like science fiction, but you have, you know, sort of this argument about, you know, did we, you know, scientists decided that we could, but should we have, you know, that whole like, you know, theme and one. And then I think that's very much like at home with like pretty much all aspects of the atomic bomb, right? And yeah, I think they try, you know, I think the movie does a good job putting you in their perspective, right? Like there's a little bit about, you know, kind of like, it's not a forefront of it, right? Like his own Jewish identity, but like, to be fair, even in real life, it wasn't necessarily anything of, crucial importance to him. Like he didn't like openly identify or like, you know, openly like, you know, practice Judaism, but you know, like it's, you know, there's that component of that, right? It's like, well, like we're developing the bomb because the Nazis are going to do it and we have to beat the Nazis, and the Nazis want to kill people like me. You know, that's sort of like the personal incentive, but like it's, you know, there's so that broader national fervor to, you know, fight back against the Nazis. And then, you know, it's like, well, after they're beat, then it's like, well, you know, Japan is still in the war. They're not going to surrender. And you get a little bit of the mixed perspectives on that, right? Where there's people who don't think that the use of it is necessary. There's people who do. And I think, you know, it's not necessarily designed, you know, maybe I wouldn't say that it says nothing, but I don't think it necessarily has, a direct meaning that like is necessarily 100% clear, if that makes sense, right? Like I think that, you know, there's room for interpretation on what exactly the film is saying, and I think that's like, I mean, that's why I like movies like this, just more generally, anyways.
I think that's a really fair analysis. I was looking forward to this film when the trailers were out, and I'm pretty happy with like how it turned out. The other film I'm really looking forward to this year is Napoleon.
Yeah, I was about to say that one I'm really looking forward to too.
I'm forward to do the episode on that film, but more specifically, I might just skip Thanksgiving, go straight to the but in all seriousness, right? Like, there's a reason why I bring Napoleon up. And when we think of like the concept of great man history, of, you know, historical events almost happening by the dictate and whim and like the will of one enterprising individual, I think that phenomenon could not have happened were it not for Napoleon, in a sense. And what I mean by that is like there's a story of Hegel witnessing Napoleon coming on horseback, and he was just standing in the street and they're seeing Napoleon and the troops march in, and Hegel wrote, I think in his diary or whatever, that he had witnessed history riding on horseback. The Napoleonic era creates this like singular idea of like great men who can dictate the whims of history through their strengths and will.
How many you know, like historical figures can you think of that have like a whole era named after them? Right?
Not many, right?
I mean, he is sort of like the case positive of like the great men of history, like theory, right? I mean, the framework, it's still like, you know, it misses important context of the historical eras, and obviously people beyond him mattered, but you know, definitely.
But if the framework,
if
the framework captures anyone accurately, it's Napoleon. I don't even think the framework would exist without him. So, I think like you can look at Oppenheimer as like the dark inverse of that lens, where like, you know, what if you put this same lens of like a major transformational event in human history almost at like the discretion and will of one man, but instead of his like, you know, personal ambition or, you know, extraordinary genius presenting him to the task, it's their own naivety, it's their own, you know, willingness to trust too deeply. It's their own foibles and weaknesses that start to dictate how that history is going to flow. And in that way, like, Oppenheimer is one of those great men of history, but like his legacy on the world isn't just reshaping Europe and inventing liberalism. His history is, the same technology that could produce infinite energy is also the one that could destroy the world entirely.
Yeah.
And he was powerless to stop the political apparatus of his day from wantonly taking that technology and running with it. And in that sense, the title American Prometheus is absolutely correct in that he gave mankind fire and now is chained for his crime. Except in this case, the chain is psychological and spiritual.
Yeah, it's like self-manufactured in some way.
Exactly.
And you maybe deservedly so. But yeah, I mean, it's always the American Prometheus like tagline that was developed for him. With that movie, I think was always very apt and appropriate.
Yeah, where it's like, does he? In a way, it's like by forces not of his own, in addition to his own foibles, he is chained to the rock and having an eagle pluck his eyes out. And it's just one of those things where it's like, were he more stronger willed, or were there, a more, if there was an American government that allowed for more free political expression, or if some accident in history was in the opposite direction, he could have been a hero. He could have been one of those real great men of history, but instead, he has a legacy marred by regret, one that he kind of realized a little bit too late, and he's sympathetic and resentful all for that in a way.
Yeah, and I think and that's again, like, all those dynamics are what makes this so interesting, right?
Exactly.
Like it's and Napoleon himself is also someone who has like kind of that, like, he's a conqueror, he's an imperialist, but also has like a huge impact, and a lot of impacts that are positive on sort of the world and like world politics in general too. So it's like it's these are like the kind of fun historical figures to explore. There's actually it's kind of relevant. My video game class that just wrapped up, one of the modules is like on superhero games, and like one of the questions is like are anti-heroes like good or bad and stuff like that, and like why, and it like kind of discuss that. And it's like these I hesitate to like use the term like anti-hero to describe like Oppenheimer, right? But like it's the same thing that like interests us in anti-heroes is what interests us in figures like him, right? They're complicated. Like they're both complicated as individuals, but also have a very complicated legacy on the world.
Yeah, and in that way, it's I think the appeal and the drama of it all is the tragedy in all of it.
Yeah.
Anyhow, our final question on all Movie Magic episodes. I forget what our scale is. I think it's out of 5. What would you give Christopher Nolan's 2023 film Oppenheimer out of 5?
I think I might just go for a straight 5. I thought it was really good. I think it hit a lot of important concepts, and I think it was a very thought-provoking film. I'll give it a 5.
I'll give it a 4.5. I think this was definitely a new line of inquiry for Nolan. I think, especially like post Inception, I'd been kind of disappointed with his work. I didn't really vibe with Interstellar. I didn't watch what was his one film that came out recently with the time travel stuff. I didn't watch that. So for him to do a biopic in this period piece,
was it Tenet? Was that
Tenet? I didn't watch Tenet.
Okay, I haven't seen that one yet.
Yeah, I didn't hear good things about it, but that's besides the point.
I liked Interstellar though.
I mean Interstellar was like it touches on certain like really emotionally resonant pieces. So like if you watch those scenes and you like those aspects of it, then for sure. But then I think like the sci-fi stuff I just found kind of like mundane and terrifying because it's mundane. So maybe it was good and it made me feel uncomfortable. Who knows? Maybe, but I'd say like for him to
I think discomfort was 100% the vibe he was
for
going
sure, for sure. So yeah, I think for him to like to apply his like his style to a period piece and have it go off, I think pretty well.
A much more, I think, fleshed out period piece than like because he did like Dunkirk before this, and that was definitely much more like this like specific historical episode rather than this, which is like covering a much broader space.
That's true, and I didn't see Dunkirk either. So yeah, so I think for Oppenheimer to have played out the way it did, at first I thought certain elements were flat, but to have it tied together with like that spiritually shattering ending with those lines from Einstein, even though they were never said, I think really delivered a resonant story of like what role does science play in relation to statecraft. And as it turns out, it's not necessarily one for the better when it's suborned. So I'd say, hats off to the production team, to the actors. This was definitely a triumph for film this year. And once again, from all of us here at the Greenhouse, solidarity to everyone on the picket lines. It's probably a W that the courts did say that you can't copyright AI stuff. I'm gonna have to read the technical aspects of that ruling, but that's definitely
that's like the slightly older case, right? Where there was like it had to have like a human owner to like do it because it was because I remember that it had come up as well in that case where like I think was it PETA that had sued over that monkey selfie?
I don't recall.
But because I remember like it was like, oh well, like technically this sets a precedent that would apply to that because it was not created by a human. So like you can't like sue and say that the monkey has like copyright. I kind of mean like intellectual IP laws. I mean that's a whole nother can of worms that we could delve into at some point. Also, there's so many like. It's like there's things that are good and horrible about them at the same time, and it's like, man, like do we really want to like bring ape kind into that mix?
Dear God, I don't know. Once you get them involved, we're in a you're basically in Planet of the Apes, but it's going to be like a Law and Order crossover, and not the action thriller film.
God, yeah. Oh man.
So, Josh, where can people find you in this increasingly disparate and somewat unstable era for social media?
We're just gonna stick with my Twitter for now. I will have an academic website for my market stuff. I mean, you could check it out if you want. It's not gonna be a super interesting content unless you're interested in hiring a PhD student to teach or do whatever. At your institution or place of work. But if you're interested in that, you'll be able to check out the website forthcoming. But for now, at Joshua Cost 17 on Twitter is where I'm at. I do have a Blue Sky. I haven't to say I have it is like the account was made. There's nothing on it, so I can't I guess it's at joshuacost.bluesky.social, so there'll probably be some stuff there eventually. I haven't totally made the transition yet, but eventually.
Yeah, I'm definitely in that mixed category of I'll post on Blue Sky sometimes, but mainly I'm just trying to let people know it's the backup for when Twitter finally hits the can.
Yeah, I mean, when I say I haven't used it, I don't even have a profile picture on there. So, like, you know, there's some ways to go on that account. But if you, like, are just looking for the hope that I post something there eventually, and I probably will, you know, feel free to check that place out. But, you know, don't go there expecting anything impressive.
Yes, I will plug the links to Josh's social in the description below, and I'll also post our link tree that has all of our up-to-date social media links. Right now, Twitter is our main spot for hosting updates. If that changes, we will try to let y'all know. That's really all I can say right now. But thanks again for coming on to talk Oppenheimer with me, Josh. It's been a blast as always. I gotta get that outline set up for current events, but that'll be soon. And thanks again for tuning in, dear listener. I think that's everything. I think I plugged everything.
I think you did.
Yeah, okay. So, till next time, take care. Bye-bye.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all